Thank you for joining us for the virtual Mindshift conference. Mindshift is an organic, informal, and international network of Christian education leaders working to catalyze innovative change in our schools. We provide forums for like-minded leaders and friends who care about the mission of Christian education to converse, convene, and collaborate. The purpose of this conference is to provide sessions related to the recent book, Mindshift, Catalyzing Change in Christian Education, as well as push beyond the book to invite discussion around pressing or controversial questions facing educators, students, and schools. After watching this keynote video, please make plans to join us later in the month for the corresponding panel discussion as noted on the Mindshift conference schedule.
All right. Well, everyone, welcome to our keynote. We just did some time pre-talking here, so I'll let each of us introduce ourselves. Why don't you go first, David? Introduce yourself, and I'll introduce myself to the folks that are watching our keynote.
Yeah, I'm David Smith. I've been a K-12 teacher. I've been a German professor, and I'm now an education professor. I direct the Kairos Institute for Christian Teaching and Learning at Calvin University. And my excuse for being in this conversation is that with several colleagues, I just finished up a big research project on how digital technology is changing learning practices in Christian schools.
Well, welcome. Thank you, David. I'm glad to be here with you. Our common friend, Dan Behrens, roped us both into this, and so that's why we're together. My name is Mitch Salerno. I'm the head of school at Monte Vista Christian School out in California, in the Santa Cruz area along the Pacific coast. Have been a head of school for over 15 years, was a teacher of chemistry prior to that. About a decade ago, just got involved because it was the time in implementing technology in schools, and have been part of that change leadership for the last 10 to 15 years of implementing technology in schools. And most importantly, how do we do that effectively? Had a chance to work with colleagues in the Mindshift and with Dan and others, and wrote one of the chapters in the book about of shifting from Gutenberg model to 5G. And so David and I are just having a pre-discussion, and we'll carry on our discussion for you by way of our keynote. So David, we agreed, I think one of the best things, you're more the research guy, the practitioner, not the practitioner, but the research. You have some really robust research. Why don't you share a bit of that research for our group, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. So four of us, myself, Kairos Evansma, Marge Terpstra, and Steve McMullen, we just finished a book called Digital Life Together that came out of several years of research where we chose Christian school systems that have been early adopters of digital technology, that were good at it, that were fully invested, that have been trying to think carefully about how to do it Christianly. Like, we wanted to see the best version sort of in operation, rather than see people fumbling with early adoption or that kind of thing. And we used 5 different research methods over a period of time. So we spent 75 hours watching 75 different teachers teach, randomized classroom visits. We did surveys of every human being in the school system. We did 36 hours of focus group interviews. We did 6 longitudinal teacher case studies of teachers who were reputed to be good at technology integration. And I had 28,000 school documents on my hard drive that I spent a year of my life reading and coding and sorting. So out of that, we were able to build up this really rich picture of what seemed to be going on in these schools that had jumped in with both feet on laptops and iPads. And what was really important to us was it felt to us like there were 2 lacks that we were trying to fill. One is that there's a lot of books out there that are either like, yay, technology, it will fix all of our problems, buy a Chromebook and your life will be beautiful. And there's also the opposite, like sort of, beware of technology, it's going to destroy your life, it's going to wreck teaching, it's taking our kids away, et cetera, et cetera. And neither of those stories is actually terribly helpful. And so we wanted to actually go in and ask a much more neutral question and sort of say, what's happening, right? Because chances are there's both good and bad things happening. And chances are it's actually kind of complex. So what practices are we building around the technologies, and how are those practices helping to carry out the mission of Christian schools? And where are we deceiving ourselves by thinking that we're carrying out the mission in ways that maybe we're not if we look more closely? So out of that, we set out to, as I say, collect lots and lots of data and try to figure out what was happening in terms of, was technology supporting the mission, what kinds of Christian formation were taking place, What did people think Christian discernment meant with technology? How were relationship patterns changing? And what was happening with learning? And came up with a whole lot of mixed findings, right? There's no one sentence, technology is good or technology is bad kind of summary. It's more like, here's a set of really interesting questions that we might want to be asking ourselves to shape how we run at this, right? So because the question can't just be, is this the shiniest new thing, or is this supposed to work, or I'm afraid of this, do I have to do it? It's going to be more like, okay, there's this device, it's got certain capabilities. What kinds of learning practices do we start to build around that so that we're still moving learning in the directions we claim to be moving it in?
Yeah, and it's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because I had the pleasure of writing a chapter in the Mindshift book with Carrie Ingram, and the title was From Gutenberg to 5G. And our motivation was, we have found in our circles within Christian schools that there was kind of what you just described. There was either kind of a very optimistic kind of, this will cure all, and we moved to it, and it was going to fix everything. Or there was kind of a Luddite reticence to get involved at all. Like, if we touch technology, it's going to ruin the gospel, it's going to ruin the kids, it's going to ruin education. And I think that the passion that we had, the mind shift that we were thinking about was talking about how Christian schools have to embrace kind of the cultural moment that we live in with the tools that exist in our day for the advancement of the mission of the organizations that we have. And hence, from Gutenberg to 5G, is you can't just live in have a Gutenberg mindset in a world that is moving rapidly towards 5G and things like phones and iPads and computers. And we're having this conversation, David, over Zoom, being recorded, and people are going to watch it remotely. I mean, it's very different than a Gutenberg world. So, some of the things that we pre-talked about, which I thought were really fascinating, you've got my mind turning, was just this. I love that description you had between I had inadvertently, for those of you that are watching, I had inadvertently just kind of haphazardly used the idea that technology is a tool. And David rightly said, let me ask you a question. I think that's really fascinating. Let's talk about that for a bit. I think that could be really a really interesting, others might have used that language. This iPhone is just a tool. My computer, my MacBook that I'm talking on is just a tool. Let's dissect that a bit.
Yeah, so we pulled out of there's lots of literature on technology and society and so on. So we pulled out of that 3 basic models or pictures of what technology is. And each one leads you to ask different kind of questions. So one of them is technology as a tool, right? So a hammer is a technology. It's a thing for banging nails with. And if you've done much carpentry, you stop noticing the hammer very much, right? It's like an extension of your arm. And the focus is on where the nail's going in. So it's just a tool. It's not, when you pick up a hammer, it doesn't make you a Buddhist, right? It doesn't change your worldview. It doesn't sort of mess with the rest of your life. It's just a tool. It gets stuff done. So that paradigm works for a whole bunch of technologies. And the kinds of questions it tends to lead you to ask are, does it work? Is it the best tool for the job, right? Can I get a better one, right? Is it effective, etc. But when you look at things like smartphones, right, it doesn't take very many minutes thought to see that there's more going. A phone is more than just a tool that I pick up to talk to people and put down again. Phones have reshaped the whole of our relationship patterns, our sleep schedules, the way we navigate highways, right? It's this much more pervasive thing. It seems like it's not just this thing that I can kind of put up or take down and it just sits there. It seems more like it has this shaping thing going on. And or cars would be another great example, right? Society with cars is pretty different from society without cars in a lot of ways, including air quality and where you go to church and where you choose to live and all kinds of stuff. So there's this second view that says, no, technology is not just a tool. It's more like an environment. We live inside technology, right? It's kind of, once we've made a technology, whether it's transportation systems or communication systems or whatever, we then have to live inside the technology we've made, and it starts shaping us, whether we like it or not. We become people who live in this technology. We become smartphone using people with good and bad consequences. And you get some pretty pessimistic accounts out of that kind of picture, because you get this idea technology is kind of deterministic. Like you can't not live in the smartphone world, right? It's or the television world or whatever it is. And people even worried about books, actually, incidentally, with Gutenberg. When that first came around, people were worried that the shift to print technology would just lead to a massive multiplication of bad information, and they weren't wrong. So there's these kind of anxieties about all new technologies. And the third one says, technology is not just a tool, but it's also not just a deterministic environment, because you can take the same technology, like let's say a television, and one family puts one in every room of the house and has got 7 of them and goes to sleep at night, falling asleep over the late night movie, and all the kids are watching it on their own in their room, et cetera, et cetera. And another family keeps one in the recreation room and rations the time the children spend on it, and so on. So you've got 2 different communities there, small communities, families, who are building different sets of social practices around the same technology. So it's not that the television is not having an influence, right? It's not like a hammer. It's not just a neutral tool. It's still doing stuff to us, but we can, to some degree, shape that influence by intentionally building practices around it. And we sort of argue in the book that it's actually worth keeping all 3 of those pictures in mind. That, sometimes it's a tool, sometimes it just helps you get something done. But the environment leads you to ask questions like, but how is it shaping me? What's changing in our community? What's it doing to us? But then the third one, the social practices, makes us ask, but it's not just deterministic. How are we choosing to build our lives in this technological environment? How are we choosing to interact? How are we choosing to structure time and so on? So that was the picture we were working with.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me about that is, as we talk about schools, so as someone who's implementing technology, I was sharing and I'm thinking about just even the moment that we're having this conversation in a COVID world. I almost said post-COVID world. I wish it was a post-COVID world, but it's a COVID world right now. And so teachers in my school are struggling with the fact that we're operating in what we call a hybrid model right now. Half the kids, not even really half the kids, are coming to campus, and the other half have to stay at home. And that's for just practical health and safety regulations, right? We just can't, we don't have enough room on campus for everyone to be here together, 6 foot distance, the whole thing, which has forced the implementation of technology, which is forcing, much to what you've described, there are tools that are shifting an environment, that are shifting social practices. And so one of the questions I think that in this Mind Shift conference that we've talked about, as we talk about Mind Shift to Mind Blown, it's something that our team has talked about, is where one of the areas that I'm struggling with is how we can assist people in this transition to actually employ or actually to accomplish the mission that we have in hand, right? So one of the things that we have here at Monte Vista is we have a social contract with families. We're going to provide them an education. They pay us to educate their kids. And I really see tension growing and building. Mm-hmm. And anytime you get close to a major shift, it seems like tension almost like, I'm a former chemist, it's almost like this activation energy you have to get over before the change happens, right? Everything just kind of builds and builds and builds. And then once it starts downhill, it all rolls. We seem to be trying to climb a hill right now, getting enough energy to actually shift. One of the questions I have is, and you've got me thinking, is what is actually shifting? Is this a technological issue or is this a practice issue? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously those are intertwined, but it's the example that's coming to the back of my mind is take a real simple technology, not one of the ones that we're terrified of, although it stresses us. Take email, right? It's an old technology now. It's almost like an older generation technology. Is email a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's a good thing, right? This week I've been networking with Christian schools in Australia and Norway, and I've been used it to be in touch with my students. I've used it to be in touch with my kids, et cetera, right? So lots of good things out of email. At the same time, I'm finding myself as a teacher educator having experiences of sitting at the back of school classrooms, watching a teacher teach for a few minutes, then give the kids something to do in pairs and turn around and start answering email on the laptop at the front of the classroom. So I'm also seeing email directly lead to bad teaching, right? A teacher who's only present half the time in the classroom is not a good teacher, period, as far as I'm concerned, right? Teaching's hard when you're paying attention, let alone if you're only half there. But then in our research, we start talking to teachers and they're telling us that they feel a lot of pressure because they're getting emails from parents that come in the middle of the math class saying, I'll be picking my daughter up in 10 minutes. So there's this expectation built up that somehow, if you sent an electronic communication, that someone's supposed to be there to see it and answer it. And I don't think the parents are trying to be mean there, but there was this pattern that lots of teachers talked about of parents expecting super quick turnaround on communications. Now, I wonder what would happen in those schools if the school and the parents and the teachers actually had a facilitated conversation about what are reasonable expectations of each other in terms of communication. A lot of businesses do this. You know, you email the help department, they say, we'll reply in 36 hours, or we'll reply in 3 business days, or whatever. And when is it not reasonable to expect somebody to be connected? So that's partly a technology question, that we've got the capacity now to see messages 24/7. We don't have to wait for the mailman to arrive. And the teacher in the classroom doesn't have to have the message passed on by the school the school office anymore. But we have to have a conversation about what's good and bad about that, and when do teachers need to be protected. So when is the teacher no longer at school, right? Is that 9 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night? When is it not legitimate to send the teacher an email and expect the teacher to see it and ask on it? When do they actually get to have a life outside of teaching? What we saw was a lot of school communities not having those kinds of conversations. And when it's left unaddressed, that's when it becomes an environment. It becomes this implicit pressure from the technology to keep doing more and more and more and more communication, because we're not sitting down and having a conversation about what might be healthy community practices around it.
Right. So when I hear you say that as a practitioner, it resonates, because one of the things even that you work with your senior team with, and then that communication gets spread downward, is a clear communication of expectations, right? And so one of the things in practical implementation is you have this collision of, let's just take an individual teacher, their expectation with what something should be, and say an administrator, the head of school, superintendent of a district, what my expectation of what the product is that we produce and how we do it. And there's these collisions, right, that seem to happen fairly regularly. I'll give you an example of one. In our environment right now, in this COVID environment, I'm continually preaching to my team, content is not king. These kids are not going to remember every ounce of content. Focus on these skills. And we happen to be a candidate IB school where we're working on these approaches to teaching and learning. But what are the skills kids can take from COVID? The content, the facts probably aren't going to be things they remember at the end of 2020. The stress is so high. Are they going to remember how to do everything with a quadratic formula? Probably not. But will they remember skills from that math class? I think so. But we're having a hard time translating that to faculty, right? Because faculty have always covered 10 chapters. A common phrase around here is, I'm 20% behind schedule. What schedule? It's a schedule that's a predetermined schedule. I share that story not because it applies to technology, but I think the same thing happens in technology implementation, is that there's this understanding socially, or there's a misunderstanding socially of what we're actually trying to accomplish, and it causes friction and tension. And that friction and tension, I think, perhaps might get placed on the technology. Technology is bad. Yeah. When the actual problem might be something different. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, it's making me think. I read an email yesterday from a colleague who had a student write to them saying, we understand that the teaching is imperfect right now compared to what it might have been because you're all adjusting to going online, etc. But the student said, I actually feel like I'm getting more than in a regular semester because I'm getting to watch my teachers adapt to a difficult and changing situation in a broken world. And I need to learn how to do that. So I think that's worth thinking about as well, that, part of what students are going to remember is how their schools and teachers responded to the situation. And if what we're modeling for students is spending all our time arguing about whether to wear masks or not, or whatever it is, then, that's probably not going to be a great lesson. But if we can model an intentional rebuilding of Christian practices around a new environment. I mean, that's whoever guaranteed that the world was going to stay put while we just carried on doing things the way we like doing them. But when there's change, the question then is, do you then throw everything that's important to you out of the window, or do you find ways of continuing to actually live your vision in the new environment?
And I think that was the point of the chapter that Carrie Ingram and I wrote in Mind Shift. Is how do we take the environment we find ourselves in, right, and utilizing those, I'll call them gifts that God has given us in our moment in history for the purpose of advancing the kingdom, right? So in Gutenberg's, it was, and we talked about it's interesting, in the beginning of the chapter, that story about John Hus, who actually was Martin Luther before Martin Luther was Martin Luther. The only thing that made them different is there's no way to propagate his idea. It just couldn't propagate. It was easy for the church, the Catholic Church at the time, the universal church, because there was only one at that time, the central seat of power, actually it was two, but their central seat of power to squash him, right? But when the press was out, information flowed freely. I was thinking about that. My friend Rex Miller wrote a book about just how technology has shifted over time, the advent of the TV, radio, TV, even airplanes. We have history at my school here where they used to fly airplanes off of our property, and our second headmaster, his brother, was a missionary pilot in South and Central America. Actually flew missionaries in and out, and that started here on this campus. That's because this school, back in the 40s and 50s, embraced the idea that the airplane could be a missional tool, right? So when we think about this, I mean, you got my mind turning now as we're talking here. How do we start to shift technology to be this missional tool? And I don't use tool in the misaligned sense. I mean it in the practical sense of something that we use to accomplish kingdom work.
Yeah. So let me be hopefully a constructive cynic here for a moment, because I do think there's an important moment of caution in here. Is one of the things we spent time looking at was some of the schools that we studied had this quite strong claim that was what had driven their technology adoption, was pursuing their mission, right? And that the technology, when we did surveys, very large percentages of people in the community said, yes, the technology has helped us fulfill our mission. Now, then when we started actually breaking down the mission statement, we found that the way technology was being used was doing more for some parts of the mission than for other parts of the mission. Mm-hmm. So to take one real concrete example, one of the claims in one of the school's mission statements, and I'm not quoting directly because we kept the schools anonymous, but there was basically a motif of, we want our students to go change the world for Christ. And technology is going to help us do that because students get tools to go out into the world, they get to connect with people in other countries, etc. And we heard lots of great stories about how technology was helping us to do that. I mean, some really dramatic things. We've got high school students who were doing joint projects with students in Ghana on how to address disability in Ghana in high school. And students were really excited about it. There was high engagement, and there was this connection to the world outside the school. And then we started noticing across 36 hours of focus groups, this is one of the benefits of doing a large study and not a real brief one, that we started hearing the same stories from different people over again in different conversations. So then when we turned to the classroom observations, we observed 75 randomly chosen classes. We watched 479 different teaching activities that we analyzed down out of those classes. Now, when you asked how many of those 479 teaching activities involved the students using the technology to connect to the world outside the school classroom, the answer was 6 out of 479. So I'm absolutely with what you're saying, right? We've got to figure out how to build practices around technology that further our mission. And the next step is we've got to figure out how not to fool ourselves that because we came up with like 6 really good examples that we're doing it now. Because it's really easy to do that because you want your mission to be true, right? And you want to be serving the kingdom. So you've got this motivation to want to believe that you're doing it. But there's also got to be this check of like, again, do our actual daily on the ground normal practices, not just the best 6 examples. Do they actually, like what students are doing with the technology on average on a normal Tuesday morning, is that pushing the mission forward? So
I see that. And when I hear you say it, it's so true, because one of the things I wrote when you were talking was, are we teaching students to learn tools, or are we building a mindset, or I guess in a Christian language, are we building a worldview, right? Because the reality is probably my example of, say, the second headmaster here, his brother flying airplanes. The world was evolving in those days fairly rapidly, but not nearly at the pace we're going now. So I was just had this thought in my mind about when I got my degree in instructional technology back in 99 to 2004, we literally were creating our own learning management systems on Microsoft Word. There was no such thing as a learning management system. Right. If I'd known what I know now, I would have created a learning management system and we wouldn't be having this conversation. I'd be in Bermuda somewhere in my house, right? But the reality is that when I worked on my master's, it was not the skill of creating a learning management system in Microsoft Word that was beneficial. It was the mindset of constantly innovating and creating and taking what's there. And so one of the things that I, as a practitioner, that I want to see, based even what you just said, is I want my school and other schools to be a place where it's not about learning a skill that's transferable. It's learning a way of thinking. It's learning that change is going to be something that happens to us. I'm noticing something very interesting during this COVID time. The people on our team that are able to cope are not the most skilled. They're the most resilient.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? They're not the most skilled. They're not necessarily the most talented. We've got some very, very talented people that are struggling right now, like very significantly. We have some other people that if you were to rank them on a talent scale might be like a 5 out of 10, but they're flourishing because they have this idea that they can change, they can grow, they can learn. I know there's research from Carol Dweck and others, but I think that some of that even goes to schools, right? I'm asking me a question. I keep asking you questions. I want to learn from you, but can we create schools around technology that have this mindset of growth, and that if that mindset within the institution is actually changed, we actually might begin to utilize technology in a way that is more kingdom focused?
Well, that does give me a question, because, you know, as a school leader, like, is it kind of cosmic fate that you got like a bunch of resilient 5s and some non-resilient 10s? Or is there anything in the school community, in the way you run the school community, the practices of the school community, that's helping those 5s to be resilient, or that you might be able to strengthen to create more resilient 5s, 6s, and 7s, right? Does that make sense, right? Is there anything you can do to lengthen the odds on getting resilient teachers?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to this idea of culture creation. One of the things that I see happening, for example, as we have this journey towards IB, MYP, middle years program, and diploma program with IB, I have some friends from Canada in Vancouver, and they have said, and they use British English with this one, but it works. And this idea of sorting is that when you define a missional focus, when you define an institutional focus, your institution goes through a period of sorting. One of the things I found as a practitioner, to your question, is how do you increase those odds of finding those people? I think one bigger question is, do leaders in schools have the intestinal fortitude to allow their community, through the development of culture, to sort people out who have that particular thinking? I think the hardest thing on the practitioner side is that you're not dealing with ideals. So on the research side, we say this is what you need to have an effective school. But on the practitioner side, it's like building a football team in the NFL. You have a salary cap. You have constraints that determine which quarterback you get, how many great wide receivers you get, how many, you know what I'm saying? And so I think one of the things that is a struggle is the building within the constraints that you have, and then the willingness, I think, to push through the culture you want. So I see a lot of practitioners who fall short, not because they don't have great ideas or they don't have a great vision. They don't have the stomach to actually say goodbye, for example, to someone who's highly talented but not resilient. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And I think that to increase those odds, you've got to be willing to make those changes. And that's where I see most practitioners. That was actually part of the heart of that chapter, is that if you want to see technology implemented in a certain way, you have to have the intestinal fortitude to work through that, and possibly say goodbye to some people who don't share that particular way of thinking. So
let me push on this. Let's assume that you know you can't say goodbye to people right now because you're in the middle of the semester. And so what are your strategies for, first of all, giving people permission to be flexible, and so that people, you know, don't feel like they're trying to. Because one of the things we saw in our study was that sometimes when things aren't articulated, everybody's got this imaginary bar that they're trying to clear. And they always imagine that everybody else is doing more than they are, right? Everybody else is keeping on top of their emails. I'm the only person who's behind, right? I think most of us live there. So how have you gone about sort of creating a culture in which the resilient ones have got permission to flourish, in which that's encouraged, right? This sort of adaptive kind of mindset.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's that ongoing discussion about what is important. So I know we were before we started a brief story about COVID, and just some teachers here, for example, were saying, I'm 20% behind my schedule right now. Mm-hmm. And as administrators, the first question that I had was, what schedule? What is that schedule you find yourself on? And I think that to your point of helping build that resilience is also getting folks to understand what we are about and what we're striving for. And there's a unity of purpose. And I think that's a broader organizational struggle that any institution has. I have a friend who's a head of school in Philadelphia, and he shared with me a story about his school, and he was asking people about who do you think we are? What's the identity of our school? It was fascinating because he said what he learned was there were 80 different identities of his school. Everybody had a different picture. And that stuck with me. And I think this answers your question. As part of building resilience, part of building unity is actually getting everyone moving in the same direction and feeling safe in that direction. I think where the friction comes in is when you have to grow and learn, but you don't feel safe. You feel like a failure, or if you fail, you'll be let go. And so this is that hard part of communicating, I think, as a school leader, what you're about. And I don't know that I'm successful at it. I think all of us are striving organizationally. It's probably the same thing happens inside of Calvin that happens at Monte Vista Christian, is getting that. But I think great organizations, great businesses, great nonprofits, where they're most successful is in that common pursuit and that common understanding of what we're about. And I wonder when it comes to technology, if that isn't some of the hang up of the implementation of technology, is that people don't know how or what they're using it for. They don't have a common goal and or even common marks of like what success looks like. And therefore you don't see it. You hear those 6 examples of the times that it worked, but in reality, most people feel inadequate to even achieve those kind of high bars. The bar has been set almost too high with those folklore stories, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, because word that's been sort of weighing on me lately. I taught an online course this summer for 40 educators from around the world with a colleague, and one of the things we asked them to do one day, because we were just experimenting with stuff, was one of their assignments was to watch a 7-minute video of a snail with some ambient music going on in the background. It's a high definition, slow motion, right? It's all you do is watch a snail for 7 minutes. Nothing else happens, right? And it was fascinating on the discussion board. First of all, seeing how many people really struggled with that, right? Like 7 minutes is not going and joining the monastery. But even just 7 minutes of like non-frenetic, non-purpose driven, right, sort of activity was really hard for some people. But I was also really struck by how many people said it was really refreshing to be given permission just to watch a creature for 7 minutes. And I've been thinking ever since, why do we need permission to do that, right? There's this, there's somehow this sense that, in fact, one teacher really touched me, this story. They said this reminds me of recently, I was in my classroom, I was teaching my kids about something, and there was this cool video about salamanders, and we'd already got past the part that had the information in that I was supposed to be teaching, but the next 5 minutes of the video was just beautiful, and I just let it run and just let the kids watch it. And I felt guilty the whole time because I was worried the school principal was going to come in and find me not following the curriculum, right?
Yes.
And I thought that to me is a terribly sad picture of schools, where you can't actually encourage kids to notice the world without feeling like, so people this is where I feel like your role, as a school leader is just tremendously important in the midst of all of this, because we're all living with these fictional stories in our heads about what we're supposed to be doing and what it means to fail and what it means to succeed. And part of what you can do as a school leader is give people permission to stay human in the midst of this process and sort of be explicit about what's okay. So that's what I'm fishing for here, is whether you've had experiences of succeeding in doing that or trying to do that.
I love it because something you just said, there's 3 words you said in there that are almost like buzzwords in schools right now. Follow the curriculum. Yeah. And one of the questions is, what is the curriculum? And who decided the curriculum? And why is the curriculum important? And so and again, I'm on the more innovative side just personally, but I taught chemistry. If I were to go back to the classroom right now, I don't think I would do what I did 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. As a young teacher in my 20s, coming through, and I became a principal at 28, but from those years from 21 to 28, I slavishly followed the curriculum. But what was the curriculum? Mm-hmm. Who told me what was the curriculum? When I talk to those kids that I taught, now they're all in their late 30s and early 40s, not one of them remembers the content I taught them. And many of them are medical doctors and doing stuff in science. They remember things that were the process of learning chemistry. Mm-hmm. Right? the process of becoming a chemist is what they remember, right? I think there's this. I love the other thing you said about staying human. I think one of the questions I have as folks interact with technology is how do we take technology, utilize it for a purpose which is actually increasing our humanness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm stuck right now as a school leader with this idea of let's follow the curriculum. In other words, and I wrote this in my dissertation when I did my dissertation because it was on motivation and why kids go into dual enrollment. Is I found that there was this fictitious story of I need to do well in high school so that I can get into a good college. Mm-hmm. Really, so I can get good grades, so I can get into a good college, so I can get a good job, so I can make a lot of money, so I can be happy. And it was this fictitious story that was actually being fed by the Christian adults in these Christian kids' lives. Mm-hmm. And because it was a false narrative, they were pursuing false motivations, which was actually, now that I look at it, feeding all the people in the system along the way. Mm-hmm. Had to feed that narrative. Does that make sense? It was just, It was a bizarre narrative. And I think that narrative still exists. And so one of the questions I have is how do we use technology as believers to shift that narrative?
Yeah. Yeah. You know? And be intentional about the kinds of, the kind of community we want to build. I was writing a blog piece yesterday. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who ran an illegal seminary in Germany in the late 1930s under Hitler and ended up dying during the war. One of his intentional practices as an educator in that seminary was, a really, really high value for him was he wanted to build Christian community, right? So he wrote the book Life Together out of that, and which was the original for our digital Life Together title. And so one of his required practices of his students in each of his cohorts, it was a small seminary, was that during each instructional session, each semester, each student had to go for at least one long walk with each other student. Because he wanted them to get to know each other. He wanted them to build relationships. And I was thinking about that this summer. So in COVID, I can't do that, right? I can't ask my students to go for long walks with each other. And in fact, I've shied away from doing literally that at Calvin because the Calvin walk is a euphemism for dating in campus culture. So I don't want to blur the lines here, right? But in a situation where we're socially distanced, where a lot of people are hurting for lack of the amount of social contact that they used to, can we actually intentionally build assignments using technology, using Zoom, using Teams meetings, where instead of using Zoom for students to watch the teacher, we actually structure ways in which individual students interact with other individual students and ask them things and find out how they're thinking and feeling, where we have individual students interact with other kinds of adults and ask them what they're thinking and feeling, and create all of this. There's no reason why we can't create a lot of social learning right in the environment that we've got if we're intentional about what kind of relational fabric we actually want to build in our learning environment. Yeah. But if we stick with the default imagination, then it's like Zoom is a way of sort of projecting yourself into 50 homes and having people do things. And that's not the only way the technology can be used. It could be used to network people.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to end our keynote because I think that leaves people thinking. And I think I'll just end it and then they'll watch this and then we'll get to dialogue with them on the date is how can we do that? How can we extend technology for the purpose of building relationships, connecting people to people, growing people from a Christian perspective, which we're coming at from a kingdom-minded, they know each other and they know the one who created them. And I think that's a question that I hope as we interact with people after this, that at least through our dialogue and discussion, and I know I feel that connection with you. So thank you for that opportunity for us to talk on camera through Zoom. And it's been fun to do this. So I hope that question is what people ask. Anything you want to close for our keynote that you want to share with folks as they thinking, and we'll talk with them later as we come back on the other side.
Yeah, no, that's a great place to finish. I mean, this is not a topic you can fix with like 5 sound bites and 2 principles, right? It's because it's about the whole way we live in the world with all of our technologies. And, digital technology is the newest one, but, the wheel was a technology, right? It's the book was a technology. So this is not a new set of questions. It's just that the change is quite fast. So the important thing to me is that we do have these kind of conversations. And yeah, it's been a blessing to be able to actually have this conversation. So even if it helps nobody at the event, I had fun. So some good came of it. So hopefully it's helpful to some other people too.
I agree. Well, thank you all for watching our keynote, and we'll be in a discussion with you on the other side when we get together.